Today, I would like to share with you an overview of a study I conducted within a STARTALK student program and through the frame of interculturality. My name is Adriana Brandt. I'm currently an assistant professor of education at Dixie State University in southern Utah, and I completed this study during my time at Indiana University. I've been involved with STARTALK as a team leader and consultant for the past 7 years, and I have been interested in exploring more deeply what STARTALK is contributing in the way of intercultural development among K-12 learners. If you'd like to learn more about the work that STARTALK programs do, please visit the website to the right of your screen. During this presentation, you will explore novice language learners' perspectives on intensive language learning experiences through a focus on 3 areas: learner motivation to learn in a novice-level classroom, relative roles of first and second language in teenage identity development, and role of teacher and learner in developing students' intercultural awareness and communication skills. This study addressed several gaps in the research on world language education. First, there is a paucity of K-12 student voice in the academic literature pertaining to world language education. The exclusion of K-12 students' perspectives in their own words effectively silences an important stakeholder group, a group whose perspective is valuable to the formation of research-based classroom curricular and pedagogical recommendations. Second, much existing research on language and culture experiences in intensive language learning programs focuses on post-program outcomes and gains, with limited attention paid to the complex nature of learners' experiences during such intensive programs. By intensive language programs, I refer to compressed language courses, language camps or retreats, or study abroad. A culminating focus on learning gains such as language proficiency or intercultural attitudinal shift can certainly be appropriate, particularly as a means to showcase the power and meaning behind such intensive learning experiences. That said, learners engaged in intensive language learning experiences experience a range of academic and psychological ups and downs throughout their learning process, and they may need additional support and guidance at certain moments and during certain encounters. As we seek to understand how learners function across intercultural boundaries and how we as teachers can assist them in their intercultural development, we must pay some attention to the real-time processing of and working through intercultural encounters and interactions. The qualitative, ongoing, real-time nature of this study was one attempt to attend to the learning process as a primary focus. Finally, there is a limited number of studies that focus on the intercultural dynamic of native-speaking teachers working with non-native speaking students in U.S. classrooms. Through focusing on a slight contextual difference, this study attempts to extend our understanding of how intercultural and power dynamics may impact relationship building between teachers and students perceptions of pedagogical effectiveness in language programs such as STARTALK. I drew the theoretical framework for this study from a variety of intercultural theoretical perspectives, as well as from what research tells us about learners' intercultural development during intensive language programs. First, starting with the idea of culture, I promote the view that culture is fluid, shifting, subjective, and multiple, which necessitates learners' active engagement in navigating cross-cultural communication. Durbin and Liddicoat name this process interculturality, a process of construction through interaction, in which subjectivities and variation are not understood as noise which obscures the object of study, but rather as its constituent parts. In this view, interculturality is a social process that requires co-construction and interaction for meaning and sense-making across cultural boundaries. Culture exists in relative spaces and has a temporal component. Individual variations of behaviors, thinking, and attitudes across and within cultures are thus not deviations from a statically situated cultural script, but rather serve as manifestations of intercultural identities underpinned by definitions of culture at a particular moment in time. To this, I add that interculturality situates cultural awareness and communicative self-efficacy as a continuum. At one end of the continuum is ethnocentrism. Within ethnocentrism, individuals have a lack of knowledge about other perspectives on the world, and thus interpret others' behavior from their own myopic cultural frames of reference. As learners engage in learning experiences that challenge their conceptions of culture as essentialized and other, They move forward on the continuum, augmenting their identities and cultural awareness in the process. In this view, intercultural development is gradual and is dependent upon active social interaction, reflection, and praxis via the restructuring of mental representations. This praxis leads to shifts in individual identity as well, as individuals' relationship to and with the world around them changes with each intercultural learning experience. This diagram depicts the aforementioned continuum, as well as the processes that move learners along towards intercultural self-efficacy. The path of a learner from ethnocentric ways of being and knowing towards intercultural ways of being and knowing is marked by a line. I've chosen to mark this as unidirectional. While intercultural understanding and identity development is by no means linear, learners who engage in reflection and praxis within intercultural encounters are likely to move forward on the continuum and not to regress to ethnocentrism. In the middle is a spiral that depicts the cyclical and recursive nature of the development of intercultural awareness and identity. Along the continuum, learners engage in various learning experiences, some formal, some informal, but all interactive, and reflect to take culturally responsive action in subsequent interactions and encounters. While cultural awareness is an important component of learners' reflection and praxis, language plays a major role as well, becoming a medium through which interculturality happens. With this in mind, the language classroom becomes a site where language and culture can be addressed simultaneously and intentionally, and where learners might engage in the types of learning experiences and meaning making that will move them forward along the interculturality continuum. In my study, I will use this heuristic to portray learners' and teachers' relative situation along this continuum, and to determine the implications for learner identity development, curriculum, and pedagogy. Before I present some key findings from the study, I wanted to share some logistical information about the study structure. This nested qualitative case study focused on 7 student participants within one STARTALK student program. This program lasted for 2 weeks, with intensive language study for several hours each day, and cultural activities for 2 to 3 hours in the evening. Students spent their remaining time in the coeducational dorm hall, engaging in relaxed social time. While 14 students consented to participate in this study, I chose to feature 7 due to the representativeness of some key demographics, such as race and ethnicity, linguistic background, geographic origin, previous schooling experiences, age, and gender, among other unique characteristics. By strategically choosing these students, I hope to more closely mirror the larger population of adolescents in any traditional language classroom. In this study, I functioned as a semi-participant due to my desire to capture students' experiences and highlight their voices in their own words. To do so, I had to function like a program participant myself, so I attended class, meals, and evening activities with participants, and I spent social time in the evenings with them as well. I used the term semi-participant to denote that I was still an adult researcher throughout this process, which is a challenge well documented in other research of the ethnographic tradition. The key forms of data I analyzed in the study were threefold. First, I analyzed students' initial entrance essays for various motivational themes. Students submitted these essays as part of the program application process in response to the question, "Why do you want to study Swahili?" Second, I took daily observational field notes and audio recordings from the language classroom, as well as evening cultural activities. Third, I conducted semi-structured interviews with each consenting program participant, ranging in length from 7 minutes to 2.5 hours. To analyze this qualitative data, I used Guy's critical discourse analysis. This allowed me to analyze learners' responses and interactions from 2 perspectives: micro-level interpersonal context, as learners developed relationships and asserted identity throughout the program, and macro-level political contexts, as learners spoke from perspectives representative of their broader cultural identities. It should be noted that all data excerpts are attributed to their participant sources, though each participant is assigned a pseudonym. The program participants requested that I use their self-chosen Swahili names as pseudonyms in my study. The first category of findings pertains to learner motivation to attend the program. Through analyzing students' entrance essays and comparing these ideas to students' public and private justifications for why they attended the program, I learned several things. First, most students were drawn to the STARTALK program due to a desire to explore something exotic or other. If we consider the interculturality continuum I posed earlier, this othering of Swahili language and culture is reflective of a more ethnocentric perspective. Othering essentializes, and that the constructed image of them, as opposed to us, is applied to all members of a group or society. In this case, Swahili is seen as an exotic object to study, juxtaposed against the bland perception of one's own culture. This is not to say that all learners position Swahili in such a way, nor that this is necessarily representative of learners' truest intentions. Dornier notes that learner motivation is dynamic, relative, and a reflection of one's social context. It seemed that the extent and nature of learners' personal intercultural experiences prior to entering this program dictated their motivational orientation to learning Swahili, whether it was knowing, an interactive, subjective orientation, or knowing about, an objective orientation to oppose a conceptual framework. In the essay excerpts that follow, I will present some student orientations in their own words, and will discuss how each of these orientations is a reflection of the learner's social context outside of the classroom. Here we see an aspirational quote from Mufasa. From my analysis of our conversations and interviews, I discovered that Mufasa is aware of how he is sometimes positioned as an outsider by the various labels that are used to describe him: Indian, speaker of non-English languages at home, English language learner, gifted and talented, and how his own intercultural identity as an Indian American incorporates a unique blend of global perspectives. Consequently, Mufasa has developed a deeper personal understanding of the role that language plays in intercultural collaboration and understanding, and he sees himself as an insider within intercultural exchanges involving new languages. Like Mufasa, Zawadi speaks languages other than English in the home, and thus possesses a different level of understanding of global perspectives. Zawadi is a Serbian immigrant who arrived to the United States at the age of 9 and is already multilingual. She speaks Serbian at home, Spanish and English at school, and spent the first half of the summer in an immersive Arabic language camp. To Zawadi, the borders of the world are not static, and language plays an important role in community building around such fluid boundaries. In this quote, Zawadi describes her experience as someone who has been positioned and who positions herself as an outsider by the majority culture, and she situates her interest in East African Swahili language through that lens. For Zawadi, this program offered an important opportunity for her to challenge the otherness placed on East Africa by Americans through exploring and taking up firsthand cultural and linguistic perspectives imparted by interacting with native East African teachers. In contrast, Akita, an African American rising junior, brought with him a more specific context for learning Swahili. His involvement in his church led him to this program, as he'd spent the last 7 or 8 years as part of a church-based African drum group. Here, he notes that he sees Swahili as serving an integrative purpose, though he really discusses how his motivation is that he can take something, that it's going to help him later when he applies to college or applies to jobs. In the program, learners use Swahili to meet their current social needs, rather than focusing on Swahili for their future social needs. More specifically, learners use Swahili to exchange social goods within their same culture peer group, not to integrate within Swahili-speaking groups. In other words, Swahili served as an extension of learners' L1 of English, as well as their English-based identities. This student group was a cohesive one, which Delay would attribute to stranger theory and parallel study abroad contexts. Within the program, the instructors used Swahili to create a table of equals. Learners were all learning Swahili from the novice low level and were to engage in a collectivist learning experience in the classroom. This sense of cohesive community carried beyond the classroom as well. Learners became protective of the group dynamic, ensuring that everyone belonged equally to the group and was included in all activities. However, as teenagers will do, learners still sought to assert some individuality, even within the cohesive group. Given that learners were operating at the novice level, I found it necessary to dig deeper into learners' intentions for using Swahili, as what learners were accomplishing via the use of Swahili was often greater than what the literal translation of a simple sentence would suggest. By comparing what I saw and heard in the classroom to what was happening outside of the classroom, I noticed that learners use Swahili as a way to assert their individual identities, particularly in ways that would ultimately benefit the group and their respective memberships within the group. For example, learners would engage in Swahili language play to convey humor, demonstrate language prowess as a way to also demonstrate helpfulness, and would use Swahili to learn more about one another, such as comparing family structures or interests. This was a way for learners to assert sociolinguistic agency while functioning at the novice level. At the present moment, development and maintenance of English-based friendships was key to success and inclusion in the program. Since learners were not yet proficient enough to convey the depth of thought they needed to nurture these relationships, Swahili instead became a symbol for the English relationship building that was happening outside of the classroom, rather than a medium for communication. Not every classroom interaction pertained to maintaining group cohesion and securing one's place within the group. At times, learners used Swahili and English in particular ways to mark themselves as individuals not belonging to the group, generally as a way to assert their uniqueness as individuals. Akita was a program participant who frequently asserted himself as an outsider. Akita noted that he utilized his skills as an entertainer to gain acceptance of his peers, but that he perceived some salient differences between himself and the other students. His subsequent interactions throughout the program did not demonstrate his attempt to resolve any of these differences. Rather, he seemed to capitalize on these differences to mark himself as unique. Akita's use of language is a testament to the symbolism of each language within the classroom space. If Swahili is the language of group cohesion in the classroom space, the use of English is a way to separate oneself. Akita frequently used his first language of English to mark himself as different or outsider within the classroom. The important role that relationships play in student learning, both in terms of motivation and process, was a nearly universal theme across the formal interviews with students in this study. While this study did not foreground teachers as participants, viewing the teachers through the student lens reveals just how important the teachers were to the program experience. Students made it explicitly known that they value relationships with teachers over nearly any other aspect of pedagogy, including topical relevance, and indicated that their relationships with teachers were limited or tense in some instructional spaces. It is important to note that all of the teachers, language teachers during the day and cultural teachers in the evening, hailed from countries in East Africa and shared a common macro-level worldview. Similarly, this group of language learners largely shared common expectations of what it means to be a student in a United States classroom. However, the expectations that teachers and students had for what should happen in each space and what each individual's role within that space should be differed as a result of these culturally defined expectations and ultimately impacted teacher-student relationship building. This intercultural dimension of pedagogy and relationship building was complicated and was perceived differently by learners in both the formal classroom space and the evening cultural space. In the classroom, the two language teachers approached classroom instruction and relationship building with learners through dual lenses of American and East African pedagogy, suggesting an emergent third space for their personal pedagogical stances. These language teachers were able to create intercultural experiences in the classroom that encouraged learners to take risks and self-reflect, but in ways that were perceived by learners to be safe and supportive. In this way, teachers helped students work through any feelings of intercultural discomfort to move forward along the interculturality continuum. In contrast, the teachers in the evening cultural program did not exhibit the same pedagogical thirdness and wrestled with their own intercultural pedagogical tension as they were not trained to teach in this sort of environment. Consequently, the evening teachers were less effective in helping students self-reflect and work through intercultural discomfort. Students perceived the evening to be a tense experience and would immediately return to their dorm space, their own shared cultural space, to vent about the experiences they'd just had. Here we see one of Hamida's takeaways from the evening sessions. As a Senegalese American herself, she has a keen understanding of both African and U.S. cultural norms. However, her quote suggests that, while she understands differing cultural norms on some level, she is challenged to work through the tension on her own. What ultimately occurred in the evenings was this. Students used their dorm space and cohesive group dynamic to combat any discomfort they felt in the evenings. In this space, students worked through their experiences of cultural dissonance by not working through it at all. Rather, because the student group shared common cultural expectations, the confrontation of intercultural discomfort became an us versus them sort of ethnocentric response, by which learners could effectively shift responsibility for their discomfort to the teachers, rather than own up to their individual roles within an uncomfortable exchange. Of note is that students were unable to transfer their intercultural processing strategies, the same ones they used in the classroom space, to this new context, which shows that much more scaffolding and support on the part of the teacher is needed for learners to fully internalize these strategies for becoming more intercultural. This study brought me to a few conclusions. First, adolescent learners are developing their intercultural identities and need spaces and support to assert, unpack, and resituate these identities, particularly as they move forward along the interculturality continuum. Learners also need to feel efficacious in communication, which is the means through which they develop relationships with their peers. In the classroom, the curriculum can and should respond to learners' needs for intercultural identity development. How can the curriculum help learners know culture as direct participants, rather than focus on knowing about the culture as a factual, othered representation of the world? How can the curriculum create space for learners to self-reflect on their roles within intercultural encounters, particularly those that learners perceive to be uncomfortable? These are questions whose answers may lead to greater meaning of curriculum for learners. Along the curriculum train of thought, these findings suggest that learners would benefit from a curriculum that is centered on learners' everyday realities and their desires to build relationships with one another. By focusing attention on learners' current realities, such as how they wish to use language today, in this classroom, and with this group of fellow language learners, teachers can maximize engagement, motivation to learn, and learners' perception of relevance for the language. Conversely, by focusing only on how learners can use language at some distant point in the future, teachers affect a disconnect. Learners begin to see the language as something to use at some abstract point in the future, and thus do not see a role for the language in their current daily lives. With respect to intercultural identity development, these findings suggest that, in the absence of teacher support and scaffolding to work through intercultural discomfort, learners' sense of self-efficacy in participating in new intercultural encounters is compromised, and that learners are likely to retreat into ethnocentric home culture relationships as a shield and comfort. If teachers view the classroom as a space and opportunity for self-reflection and dialogue about intercultural identity development, teachers can create conditions that support learners in working through their discomfort, and that support learners' development of strategies that they can autonomously apply to new contexts. Together, teachers and learners can examine their respective cultural assumptions about learning, what happens in the classroom space and how, and what the teacher-learner relationship should be and look like. In turn, the classroom space can facilitate the development of negotiated pedagogical stances that would be comfortable to teachers and learners, but also allow learners to experience the target culture and different cultural frames of reference in non-threatening yet meaningful and culturally appropriate ways. These findings also raise additional questions for the field, particularly how we as educators may be marketing world language study to learners. What are we doing that causes learners to view target language speakers as belonging to an other group? What are we doing that causes learners to view language learning in terms of return on investment and the benefits of knowing about rather than being a part of? And what are we doing that may silence learners' very real experiences of cultural dissonance? By facing these questions head on, we can help encourage further movement along the interculturality continuum and ensure that our approaches are consistent with our beliefs about why we learn additional languages in the first place. Thank you for sharing your time and attention with me today. I hope that you leave this presentation with new ideas to ponder or takeaways that you can apply to your current teaching contexts. If you have questions for me or would like to discuss these findings in greater depth, please contact me by phone or email. Key references for theorists who helped me interpret these findings are on the slides that follow.